All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to Giants. I'm very excited about today's episode because Jeffrey Schostak is with us. Jeffrey is president at Schostak Brothers Company. But his story, his family's history is amazing. But I'm excited because I've known Jeffrey, 7, 8, 10 years now. And I know Jeffrey as a father of three, a husband to Rachel, golf buddies. We talk business and life, but we never really get into your business. So this show, it's really just about people in their businesses, all different types of businesses, and your family's history and your current in the company is absolutely amazing. So I'm super excited to have you talk about a lot of different things. We have John Leonis.
And I'm excited because I've seen that giant sign over by the Palace of Auburn Hills and wondered what was going on with it when it was still up, and I'm excited about hearing a little more about that too.
Yeah, so thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is Schostak Brothers and Companies. You are what generation?
Fourth generation.
Fourth generation.
G4 as we call it.
All right, so G4. When you think about that, okay, that's very special. So I don't know if you guys know these stats. I was looking up some of these stats. So 30% of companies survive to G2, generation 2. 12% survive to third gen. 3 to 4% survive to fourth generation. So that is super unique. The company's 100 years old, 102, 103?
103, yeah.
103
1920.
years old. Another crazy stat, less than 1% of companies, 0.5% of companies make it over 100 years. Like, these are crazy stats, and you guys do it pretty seamlessly. I'm sure there was a lot of challenges along the way, but I guess, what's it like being Gen 4? And what are some of the things you're going to do, which sounds virtually impossible, to get it to Gen 5? What kind of things are you experiencing now, and what's going on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Obviously we're very proud to have gotten this far. Like you pointed out, Simon, G4 is very rare. And it really kind of goes back to my grandfather, who was G2, and he really instilled this like family glue, as we called it. And so everyone grew up, whether it was his 4 boys, then 2 daughters later in life, and then now my generation, which is the cousins, we all grew up very close. And, we always did things together. We vacationed together. My dad and uncles, they were sailboat racers together, so they were living on these sailboats in close quarters. And so his whole thing was, really togetherness and this family glue. And it makes a huge difference because families, if you're not close, as families get bigger, business gets bigger, it's a challenge. I think the biggest key now is now we're in the cousin generation. And, we didn't grow up sharing a bedroom like my dad and uncles did. But, we grew up close. And so it's really just making sure, all of the things that really my dad and uncles set up in the transition from G3 to G4 is that we need to make sure to instill those properly to continue on from G4 to G5. And a lot of those things are, if you want to work in the business, great, we'd love to have you. There's no obligation, there's no indentured servitude, as some people joke about it. But if you want to work, we want to have you. But my grandfather used to say, separate but equal. And so he would never really have, my uncles doing the same thing. And a great example is how we're in the real estate business and the restaurant business is the youngest brother, Mark, of G3, when he was ready to join the business, my grandfather, kind of your classic, post-World War II entrepreneur, and he built this big business, and he said, real estate's good. We got Bobby and David, and we were at the time, there's an opportunity to get in a restaurant business. He said, Mark, you're in charge of the restaurants. So I think the biggest key to kind of growth is you don't want too many family members doing the same thing. And if you can find ways to sort of divide and conquer, and fortunately the business has grown enough that we're in all different asset classes, that we should have the opportunity to do that. But it's not easy.
No, I'm sure.
And it takes a lot of planning.
Yeah. That's unbelievable. And you said food and real estate. Did you always gravitate to the real estate?
Yeah, I always did. So, growing up, I don't know exactly why or how. Like, I have an older brother. He's a doctor. He worked in the mailroom and stuff at the office like we all did, but he never really seemed to want to get into the real estate business. For whatever reason, I always did. I would go on business trips with my dad when I was little. I'd carry his briefcase. work in the mailroom as a kid, which is a rite of passage. If you want anyone that's worked in the Schostak Brothers, it's a family member, started in the mailroom. Like we would do it in the summers, we would do it Mondays after school, we'd get dropped off at school, at the office and do it. And, random spring breaks, I would work there instead of, maybe going on a trip or whatnot. I just always kind of wanted to do it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm Lebanese and Italian. I grew up in family businesses, and we talk to none of our family members, so I kind of envy what you guys are doing. That's unbelievable. John, you're a crazy history buff. When you said 100 years, what had popped in your mind?
Visually, I think about the 1920s, and your family was probably even here just slightly before that, and the different challenges of the times without the technology, and having to have probably business connections because it's probably so much business to business transactions, and it also being so much more consolidated in those big, beautiful buildings in Detroit and not as spread out as it is now. But I mean, there's probably incredible stories, that are written down or just passed on in your family. Anything that serves as an example.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, you look back and obviously, go all the way to the 20s, but even the 70s and 80s, it's amazing, how they were, you kind of laugh, like, how'd you get things done, without phones and computers? But if you really go back, so we actually have in our office, I could send you a picture of it, it's 2 original Detroit City plat books. And they're pretty big, they're about this size, and there's 2 of them right next to each other. And that's how my great-grandfather found property. He'd open it up, he would look at it, you'd figure out, where to go, and he would send people off, and they're very, very cool books. But really is what we were doing back in the 20s and, 30s, post-Depression, is we were helping merchants. You're right, it was mostly downtown Detroit or kind of greater Detroit. It was essentially merchants that owned a retail shop, whatever it might be, on Woodward Avenue, Washington Boulevard, Livernois, whatever it was, and we were just helping them grow. We were essentially tenant rep brokers before that term existed, and that's what my grandfather did. The company started, in brokerage, and it was, it's hard to imagine, some of these stories are so old, you don't know, like, all the truth to them. But yeah, a lot of the cool buildings in Detroit, if you're around this long, my great-grandfather had, part in a lot of them.
Oh, cool. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, that is cool. I watch, I'm really big on the Men Who Built America and all that stuff, and you hear these crazy numbers about what do you got?
Go on. I was just gonna
Plugging something?
Yeah, I just need to put a little bit of this in.
The Men Who Built America, and you see these crazy numbers they were talking about, like hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Like, how do they manage? Like right now, we get on our phones, we wire money, right? And we do all this, simple. Like these guys had actual cash and checks, and banks were getting robbed, and it's pretty remarkable how you could grow back then. I find it really fascinating. So I remember you told me something a long time ago that your family kind of, and I can't remember the exact details of it. If you wanted to get into the family business after college, didn't they kind of wasn't there a process?
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to work in our family business, you have to work away for 5 years. Now, by the way, you don't have to work in real estate, you don't have to work in restaurants, but you got to do something on your own. And it was one of the things when we were starting the transition, but before the transition really started from G3 to G4, but when we started knowing that I was going to get in the business, my dad and uncles went to Kellogg and Northwestern. They have a family business program, kind of took up some pointers, some things they recommend, got a family business consultant. And that was one of the things that came out. So we kind of started to put a few of these rules in place. And really the reality is, look, every person's situation is different. So when people ask me, I'm not always pushing it on them, because you never know. It could be an older founder and he wants to work with his kid for a couple of years, and so he doesn't want to wait around for that because maybe he's older in life or unhealthy, whatever it might be. But if you can do it, it's a great thing, because I worked in Chicago for 5 years. You're on your own. You're making your own mistakes, you're learning things on your own, you're building your own network, and then if you do choose to come back, you've got a little credibility because you did something else, and you've just learned on your own. My time period was 2005 to 2010 in Chicago. So 5, 6, 7 was go, 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 go in commercial real estate. Everyone was developing anything they could, buying anything they could, and then boom, screeching halt, global financial crisis. So I think the timing worked out great for me because I saw the highest peaks of real estate all the way down to the bottom, arguably, probably not arguably, the worst since the Great Depression. And hopefully, nothing we'll see again in our career. Yeah. But I think it's a great rule because it just kind of helps you grow up away from the family. Another rule we have that kind of ties into that a little bit is you don't report to your parent. So, my mentor, so to speak, would be my uncle. And so he's CEO, I'm president, that's who I report to. I would never report to my dad. And for obvious reasons, your relationship with your dad is going to be different with your uncle. I'm super close with my uncle, but he's not your dad. There's things you'll say anything to your dad, and maybe there's things you'll hold back to your uncle. You want to, be a little tougher, whereas your dad, you'll show some more vulnerability. And I think that's a great rule.
That is a cool rule. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, my son, who's going to be 6, and his cousin Vinny, who is 6, got picked up the other day by our other brother Joe, and hung out with him for 8 hours. They went fishing, they did all this stuff, and the first question was, how'd they do? He was like, they're amazing, they're great. Like, they listened. We went to lunch. Like, they did everything I told them to do, and I'm like, that's weird, because if I had them for 8 hours, like, that wouldn't have went down that way.
So it's amazing how well they listen to other people.
Yeah.
But that's exactly it.
That's exactly it. So experience. You leave. You have 5 years. Awesome. You probably gain a lot of knowledge and experience a lot. You come back. You work for how many years before getting the president position?
So I moved back in the fall of 2010, and I was a director. And then I want to say I became president 2023. Probably, actually I can remember exactly. It was 2018, I believe. Okay. I think it was like late 2018.
So 5 years.
No, 8 years.
Oh.
2010 to 2018.
Gotcha. I'm sorry, I'm thinking 2018. Okay. Yeah, but now you've been president for 5 years.
Yeah.
Got you. So okay, here's another thing I think about. Like, we've been DOBI and our businesses have been open for 5 years. Change is insane. It's moving faster than ever. COVID, HR issues and challenges, right? Legal issues. People are just all over the place now. It's moving really, really fast. We've had to constantly be changing and adapting. 100 years, you guys have done this 1,000 times. You now are the next generation to come in, kind of, plant your seed and get into, start taking control. How about the generation before? Are they pretty good with change? Are they letting you kind of do your thing? Do they kind of step back a little bit? Like, I could see that being these guys who were in control forever now, or even employees who did things one way under your parents' generation. How hard is that? Or is it kind of just you just keep doing what they're doing?
No, it's honestly, it's a great question because look, I mean, if you've been doing something successfully for 35 years, you're not exactly like, oh, let's just try something completely new, right?
Of course.
It's just the natural behavior.
But culture changes, everything changes,
so
right?
The one thing that I think really helps my generation, G4, is my grandfather was a little unique and rare for his era. He could let go. He was able to hand off the business. And that was rare for that era. So he died 10 years ago, he would have been 90. So he basically got in the business in the early mid 50s. So like that era of businessman, you guys all know that type. And so he was able to hand off. And so because he was able to do it, my dad and uncles, had that same sort of mentality. And we kind of learned pretty quickly on once I got back that, you had to really let me do my thing. And part of the thing what I wanted to do when I came back, which is also what the family wanted, is look, we've been around long enough. We have a portfolio of certain different asset classes. I wanted to come in and kind of create something new. And not just come in and manage our retail properties or manage our office, because we have a team for that. What value am I really adding? What am I really creating to help grow the business? And so really, the intent with the new members that come in G4 is to create that new niche, a new way, a new business unit within the business, whether it's a new asset class within real estate or whatever it might be, to create, financial success and whatnot. And so we kind of understood quickly that, my Uncle David, he couldn't come to my meetings because if he's at the meeting, he's the guy with the white hair and everybody wants to hear from him. And so it was almost like, I don't want to say sink or swim, but it was kind of like, figure it out, talk to me before meetings. If you have questions, come to me after. And over time, just like anything else, if you're doing deals, you're learning. Like any business, once you start doing it, you just learn on the job. And the reality is, you're going to get things wrong. You're going to make mistakes. That's how it works. But if you made that mistake, this is kind of a famous George Washington line, if you make a mistake, you are now in way better position than the guy that didn't make the mistake, because you'll never make that mistake again. At least that was George Washington's mentality. He wasn't making the mistake again. Some of us do, but our whole thing is, look, make a new mistake every day.
Yeah.
And, so that was kind of how we separated it, is he was able to, my uncle and dads were kind of just able to sort of hand it off. Not that they handed everything off in the business, but go do your thing, come to us with questions type of thing.
I call it the process, not to cut you off, John, but I call it the process where like you have to experience and go through the process. When we got into this business 5 years ago, if I just took over a huge company, I would fail miserably, right? And I tell agents this all the time, that just get in the business, they want to go out and do 30, 40 units in a year. I'm like, right. If I just handed you 40 units, you would fail miserably. You have to go through the process of doing 10, 12 units, 18 units, then the next and the next, then you build yourself up. I mean, I want to lose 100 pounds, go run 5 miles and eat 1,200 calories starting tomorrow. No, you got to build yourself up to that, right? So that's you have to go through the process. You have to fail. I agree with that statement. You fail more than you succeed. John,
I've got a couple basic questions, and I think that people sort of wonder this sometimes about residential real estate. They ask, do you just sell in Michigan? Do you sell in Florida? Where else do you sell? Commercial real estate and Schostak and Brothers, is it a Detroit thing? Is it a Michigan thing? Or is it a Midwest thing?
Yeah, no, great question. So obviously we've been around long enough, so it's kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit over the years. I would say our heritage was enclosed mall shopping center development. That was real big, post World War II. Everyone's moving to the suburbs, all that sort of thing. And at that point, we were in the Great Lakes states. And that was, my grandfather called it that because he was a sailboat racer, so he was a Great Lake racer. So that's, but essentially the Midwest, doing shopping centers and malls for Kmart. I would say today, all of our development is pretty much in Michigan. Development is tough. It's really, you got to be local, or you got to have people in those markets to do ground up. You're not going to see great deal flow unless you're there. You're going to see deals that have been picked over and passed over by the local groups if you're not really active in markets. And we're very active here, and people know us. On the acquisition front, we are in 30 different states. So we'll buy industrial in the Midwest, and we'll buy retail essentially anywhere, a specific asset class of these Walmart-anchored shopping centers.
Does that create travel for you?
It does, but we have a specific team for those Walmart properties, and so I have very little day-to-day involvement in those. And then the industrial, I was doing it out of state on my own, and with 3 little kids and a lot of other things to do, it's just tough. I mean, you're not going to get deal flow unless you're in these markets. It's just the reality. You got to be there. And so we brought someone on, and he's actually been a great help because he's younger. He can be in these markets. He's goes there as often as you need to, and we've been able to get some good deal flow out of it.
So you keep talking. I hear you say team a lot, and again, I'm relating this a lot to what we do. So we started 5 years ago. And when you start, there's just a couple of us that are like grinding, and we're doing everything. We're wearing all hats. Like Rena, was wearing a ton of hats on the operations side. Like she was doing accounting and marketing and all these different things. Then you start to grow, and going from doing everything to letting people do their thing, and then creating, now we're at I think about scaling. And you're like, how do you really scale this business? And I think one of your core values at your company is entrepreneurship.
Yeah, entrepreneurial, yeah.
Yeah, so that hit home with me when I was going through your thing, because I'm like, you have to find people that you can let kind of be entrepreneurs, give them some rope, let them do their thing, not oversee them. I think when I think about a company in 30 states in the food business, restaurant business, retail, industrial, plus other things you guys have going on, like you have to have solid teams. So, how is that managing these team leads? I don't know what you guys call them. I'm sure they all have their own title, but a lead, a team member that lets them do their thing. I mean, is that easy for you? Is it kind of like hard to manage these guys? Because I feel like an entrepreneur can be aggressive and be maybe, I know how I am. Do you find challenges with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, of course, right? I mean, managing people is definitely one of the toughest parts of any business. Because we've been around so long, we have a lot of systems and processes in place. So it's almost like the flip side of that sometimes is we need to make sure, that's why it's a core value of ours, that we stay entrepreneurial. Because it's easy when you've been around a while and you've got a kind of a stable base of portfolio and teams of people that we're lucky that we have a lot of longevity with our people. We've had people that have been with us a long time. So a lot of people are promoted within. I mean, we have a woman that started as a secretary 30-some years ago, and now she's VP of all asset management and oversees, you know, all of our retail and our office portfolio of properties. And so we've been good at being able to kind of bring people up and then give them the rope to do things, because the reality is you can't do everything. And if you try to do it all, you have no choice, you know, when you're a young company until you kind of build it up. But I mean, it's definitely a challenge. But I mean, the way I look at it, it's you got to hire the right people, and you got to, you know, hire people that believe in our core values. You got to be entrepreneurial, you got to be opportunistic. You know, they got excellence as one of our other ones. People, integrity. If you act with those 4 items when we're hiring somebody, we know there's going to be a pretty good opportunity, pretty good likelihood that they're going to succeed. And look, no different than my uncle with me is kind of how I use one of our newer hires to go buy the industrials. I let him do his thing, come with questions, but learn on your own. Because look, at the end of the day, like, we're all afraid to make mistakes, certainly when we're younger. And then you realize everyone makes mistakes. Now, half the time you're talking to people and they tell you something, it's not true. You know, you just kind of learn that over doing. And so once you kind of understand that, it's like, yeah, you can let a younger person go out there. You know, what's the worst that's going to happen? Obviously, you have to still keep an eye on people and have, you know, standard reporting. But I think that process and just that sort of like internal way that we look at things how we operate is you got to let people kind of control their own destiny.
And they're happier. They last longer. They're happier. I wouldn't want anybody looking over my shoulder every day. I mean, you got to let them do that.
Nobody likes that.
Yeah, nobody likes
They can pretend, but they don't.
I mean, there's people that you have to do it with, or else they literally will like walk off a cliff. That's why, you know, John's with us today. I have to be with him all the time.
He knew me very well before he hired me, so he knows how weird I could be. Yes.
Yeah.
You know, our generation, when we talk about the different generations, has probably experienced the biggest cultural change over the last 4 years than we've seen in a while. And I'm sure that the culture has changed from generation to generation, but you're probably also seeing the mentality change among maybe younger employees, younger agents, as they get started in your company. And, you know, work from home versus coming to the office every day, you know, different work-life balance. How are you navigating that? What is your experience in observing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tough one right now, right? I mean, it's kind of up in the air. It seems like the vast majority of people like that work-life balance. They like the hybrid work. So we went hybrid work after, you know, everyone was coming back to the office. And it works fine. I mean, I think it's better when everyone's there. It's just the reality. But, you know, were people there longer than they maybe needed to be? Penning the jobs probably as well. Technology has made it obviously a lot easier. So in theory, reality, maybe it did make sense a little bit to adjust some work hours based on the new technology. You know, did we need to work the same way you did 30 years ago? But I will tell you, there's nothing like being in the office. And I find that a lot of the people want to come in. You know, they want to be there. It's, you know, an easier place to work. It's easier to walk into someone's office and, you know, ask a question or whatnot, where, you know, booking a Zoom or calling someone up. But I mean, I think it is a lot of the new reality. But I think if you can, I mean, a lot of the younger people should want to come in because that's how you learn.
Yeah, that speaks highly of your culture, because if you do have a strong culture, then people will come in and they want to. And that's how I feel around here. And that's why I come in every single day, because I like being around this. The atmosphere just breeds positivity and success.
It's energy. Yeah. I mean, you sit at home and, you know, you don't get that energy. Like-minded people, pushing to accomplish the same goals and win. Again, you get bigger and maybe it's easier to do in some areas or some departments of your company, but you know, our experience is anybody who sits at home, it just doesn't work. But I can see how it works a couple days a week, 1 day a week, a couple times a month, whatever. And again, depending on what they're working on versus, it's a big deal.
The biggest thing we noticed during COVID is you could do everything that had to get done could get done. You know, any issues or just like how the day-to-day, but growing the business, you got to be around people, you got to be in the office, you got to be or hitting the streets, whatever your type of role is, not in your house.
I agree. So you've been in this position at the company for a while now, but in this position for 5 years. What is since then to today biggest accomplishment as the president? Most proudest moment as the president?
I don't know if it's a specific moment, but I would say, kind of like I talked about earlier, like creating your own niche, coming in and really creating value to a business, that was fine without you, quite frankly, right? And so what I'm most proud of is really kind of creating this new business unit, so to speak. Like, we were never in the industrial space. And it wasn't like I had some big grand idea like, oh, hey, we should get an industrial. It was just out there working, working the streets. When I mean working the streets, talking to brokers, doing that whole thing, and just finding out that, like, hey, maybe there's some opportunity here. And we started kind of finding ways to make money in that business. We started buying buildings that nobody wanted. They were, Class B, Class C buildings. They needed lots of money. Maybe they didn't have all the characteristics, but we kind of found a way to create a niche. And next thing we knew, we built up this business that, was about 9 industrial buildings that, 4 or 5 million square feet. And we were creating all this value. We were leasing up vacant buildings, churning and burning, and it really kind of became its own business unit that really was able to, create a lot of liquidity that, maybe was tied up and unavailable in some of our other deals that were just at different life cycles. Because real estate, it's almost like, baseball, right? You get 3 hits out of 10, you're in the Hall of Fame. If you're making 3 deals a year, like the kind of things we're looking for, larger deals, that's a great year. But like, you're not getting 3 deals if you only have 3 in a pipeline. Your pipeline better be 10, 12. And so, like, I would say growing that business. And the other area was we got big in the built-to-suit business again, which is really developing headquarter-like buildings for really Fortune 500 companies. Like we did MASCO's headquarters, Henniges Automotive, University of Michigan Health, things like that. And so, like, those were 2 business units that can be very profitable, but they're very competitive. And you're not going to get those deals. You're not going to be out there finding, value-add real estate or off-market or big corporate built-to-suits if you're not really out there doing that. And the reality is my dad and uncles, they were too busy on other parts of the business to do that. And they were kind of managing the business, growing kind of what we had, but they weren't actively going out looking for all this new stuff. And so when I was kind of able to create that, that made me proud because it was like, hey, I came here because, in a family business, your biggest concern's not really the word, but maybe, you want to make sure that you're doing something. You don't just want to like be there, like you just join the family business, and you're just another guy in the office. Like you want to like create something and grow it. And so when that kind of like all started to, come to fruition, it was, proud that like, hey, I created something here that, has had really good, success for the family.
See, this is where I find real estate so interesting because there's so many niches. Like we sell residential real estate. Then within residential, you have investors, right? You have all these different things. And then commercial, there's a million different niches. And I remember in 2008 when the market got really, really down and tough and it was the ugly years, I remember seeing industrial buildings for 50 cents a square foot, like signs, 10,000 square feet, 100,000 square feet, 50 cents a square foot, to now today, 15 years later, you're seeing these deals at the square price per square foot pricing, and you're like, oh my God. So what years between '08 and now did you see that the market was going to take a shift into where industrial was going to be profitable? Because nobody wanted industrial 15 years ago. And what made you? What gave you that trigger point, or to say we got to go in industrial?
Yeah. So basically, you had the global financial crisis, right? And GM and Chrysler at the time filed bankruptcy. Ford kind of worked their way out of it. All these OEMs, all the tier ones had similar bankruptcies, whatever, restructuring, all that sort of thing. So these buildings were, to your point, on the market for cheap. From call it 2008 to 2010, 11, single digits. We bought one for $1 a foot. We bought a 1 million square foot building for $1 a foot. But generally, people were buying buildings for $5, $10 a foot. It's crazy. $15 a foot. And so but come 2010, a lot of people, if you weren't obviously everyone in Detroit's somewhat connected to the auto industry because that drives this town. Nice little pun there. And they came out of bankruptcy and they start printing money because they had these clean balance sheets. So then the tier ones are doing well and they start getting up to selling almost 17 million cars again, and they surpassed that. So it's kind of like all of a sudden, all these tier ones, all these tier 2 suppliers and tier 3 are doing well. The OEMs are doing well because they're making money again with way better balance sheets. And so the industrial brokers, which is really where our deal flow comes from, is really the brokerage community, is they're busy. And yet you could still find discounts because it just takes time when you have that much vacancy like industrial had. I don't know what it was, maybe 20, 30% vacancy out there, Now it's sub 2%, and it's been sub 2% for probably 7-8 years. It takes time to just fill that up, even though the market's good. So there's just opportunities to buy these buildings. And I would say, we bought that one for super cheap, but on average, we were paying in the 20s, $20 a foot range. So, maybe $20 a foot, 25, 32, all in that range. And rents just kept rising because that market just kept increasing. So it's kind of one of those things, auto's doing well. The industrial brokers are busy again. New contracts are coming out. They need more space. And then now, to your point, industrial you could have bought for super cheap. Now it's the hottest asset class in commercial real estate.
It's crazy.
I mean, multifamily's always up there. Like they always kind of ride number one. But industrial's right there with it. And in a lot of ways, better because of, you get one long-term tenant. It's more comfortable than multifamily. Obviously, if there's a dip in the market,
Well, so 2010, it started to bounce back. That makes sense. Clean balance sheets, and they start to rock. Now we have this 13-year run, which I would say has been a hell of a run from 2000. I mean, I'm speaking from my experiences in residential. 2000, like late 11, like 12 to 2021, residential was insane. Everything just kept going up. Inventory was good. It started getting tight the last couple of years. It's really tight now. But now you're talking, sub 2%, right? Where's the opportunity in the next 10 years? Is it, what do you look for? Because when you can't create inventory, what do you do?
And can I add a sort of a follow-up? Because I thought this was sort of interesting with your Chicago roots in seeing a change happening in both Chicago and Detroit. And we sort of made that comparison in the last podcast in the restaurant industry. Is there a shift? I mean, if it's so industrial, is there a shift back to Detroit? And is it coming? Is it where? Does it have anything to do with, some negative perception in Chicago, perhaps? Does that have anything to do with it? Or, I guess follow-up to that is, how is Chicago and Detroit similar and different, and what do both futures look like?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I'll start with Simon's. I mean, the one thing we didn't talk about is how low rates have been. And so during this cycle that we've had that's been great for industrial, residential, everything really, in real estate, including office up until COVID. Office even was okay. I mean, suburban office in Chicago, Detroit, a lot of Midwest markets, struggles, but rates were so low. So it was easier to get deals done. I mean, just quite frankly, you could pay more when your cost of capital was less. Now that's doubled, in the last year and change. And so the execution now makes it, while there's still opportunities out there, there's not as many, but they're out there. I mean, people say, you can't find value. You can always find it if you're really out there grinding, hustling enough to find it. They are there, but there's less of them. But the execution now, because banks, the stress in the banking system is way different, cost of capital is way more, so everything you can't pay what you used to be able to pay for deals anymore. Just hard to do. There's not as much leverage, and while rents keep rising, which helps, but at the end of the day, every other piece that's important to the deal isn't there. So I think the opportunities there will be properties that go back. There just will. Now, will it be an industrial? I don't know, because rents keep rising and tenant activity is still pretty good.
And those go back because the loans that those current owners have are coming due. Like those are 10-year loans.
They're usually a lot of time. So it all depends, right? If there's the securitized side and then there's more like the bank and the syndication. But generally, all these bank loans are floating rates. So if you locked in at 4 or 5% and now you're at 8, 9% and you bought a deal at a 5% cap rate and rents are going to keep going up, well, you're underwater.
Yeah.
And so depending how strong the sponsor is, you might have to give that back. On the securitized side of it, they're 10-year term notes and they're fixed, so in reality. But if you're banking on kind of a value add, you're buying maybe a multi-deal and you're going to spend some money on improvements, you're going to lease it up, all of a sudden your cost of capital doubled in that time period, the numbers might not work, so you might give it back. And you'll see some of that, but that takes time. I mean, it doesn't go through the system that quickly because the reality is banks don't want them back. The securitized side definitely can't take them back. They're not, equipped to do it. I mean, they did it in 2008 and 9, and it was a disaster. So that just takes time. You would think they'll extend and not want to take them back because they don't want to do that. But some will, and there'll be opportunity there. Your point, John, on Chicago and Detroit, and just kind of the Midwest in general, is there's definitely a push towards, with EV, electric vehicle manufacturing, and it's kind of like a couple things where they want to go. They need the labor, that's critical, and they need, states that are good for business. Illinois is not, it's a really high tax state. You're not hearing of any of these EV plants in Illinois. Right. If you really think about where they're going, they're in Michigan, which obviously makes sense. We have a good labor force here. Taxes are relatively low, but we're not as, we're not right to work anymore, so we're not as strong as Kentucky, Tennessee, and kind of more of like the Southeast is getting a lot of them. So I think you'll start to see, you're already seeing it, it's been going on for a while. The Southeast will continue to have growth, and I think Detroit will always have it because we have such the supply chain's here, manufacturing core is here, and the good labor's here. But the reality is, a state like Illinois, these high tax states, will struggle a little bit to get some of these big deals. But at the end of the day, if the labor's there, that's, I think, still the largest contributing factor.
A lot of friends that moved to Chicago, between 2008 and 2011, either moved back or somewhere else. Just seeing a lot of that. So it sort of sparked that question. And, we're seeing great things around here. Now, in a sort of micro Detroit suburban geographical economic kind of question, I live in Rochester Hills. The Palace of Auburn Hills moves down to downtown Detroit, and it was like 2 minutes away from my house. I always saw the Schostak sign, after they moved, and then of course the Palace is razzed, and it's currently a parking lot with a bunch of cars in it.
They're gone. Cars are gone.
Cars are gone. Okay. What is to become of that property?
Those are all Jeff's cars.
Oh, wow. There was like 400 cars there. That's incredible.
So the interesting thing about all those cars, by the way, obviously everyone drives up north on 75, certainly in the summertime, so people would always comment on that sign. And the cars, people are like, what are you doing there? What's that huge pile of dirt? And what are all these cars? And that was, the chip shortage. Oh, right. So if you remember, you don't hear about it anymore, but, there was that plant in Japan that blew up and, others and whatnot. And so all these vehicles were made and they had no chips. And so they needed somewhere, the auto industry, it's not uncommon. There's companies that literally for the auto industry, that's all they do is they find parking for cars that are done, but they can't store them on the lots, the assembly plants anymore. So that was just cars being parked there without the chips. Okay. And over time, they kept kind of changing what they were, but that eventually, they got that problem solved. We bought that. It's kind of interesting timing. So we bought that in the summer of 19, or we closed, and the plan was high-tech office R&D, kind of what you see up and down I-75, M59, Rochester Hills, office R&D, flex-type buildings, big Tier 1 suppliers, things like that. Well, COVID happens. That business basically shuts down. Yeah, R&D was still active, but obviously people weren't in the office, and office space, still today, CFOs don't want to really spend a lot of money on it. And so they call it like corporate headquarter office R&D business, which has always been so strong in that marketplace, which is why we bought the Palace, essentially went away. And so we're like, man, what do we do with this thing? When you buy vacant land, and we bought it from a billionaire off market. It wasn't like we stole the thing. And so we paid retail pricing for it. Until you get that first deal, you're nervous. You have sleepless nights. Like, we got to put this property to work. And so we were like, what are we going to do here? And then all of a sudden the EV thing, it's all everyone talks about now in automotive, but really in 2020, it wasn't that much talked about yet. People were still talking about autonomous was going to be first or whatever it was. The EV the transformation to EV is huge for industrial real estate. It just is. And so now, and it's been in the paper, so obviously happy to talk about it. We're working on a large building for GM. So GM has the Orion plant down the street where they're going to be making the electric Silverados, Sierras, and Sierra Denali pickups, which is great because those are, you would think will be big selling items because the non-electric trucks are some of the best selling items. So this is a mission critical electric vehicle parts plant for that facility. Wow. So everything they're going to be They're going to be manufactured somewhere else, and then they come through our building, everything but the batteries, and they get put together, and then it's 24 hours a day, 365. The parts from here will go to Orion to build the electric trucks, which is a truck a minute.
Wow.
Every hour. That's exciting.
That's awesome.
Incredible.
That is incredible.
And
Pretty cool. So that will take up most of the site, but not all of it. But obviously it's a great deal, and we're super excited to be a part of it, working with GM. And then we'll have about another 20 acres to develop, once we get that next deal.
you mentioned that man-made mountain that just keeps slowly over time, maybe getting bigger. Is that? I mean, the rumor, of course, is always that it's going to be a ski resort. Is that? Do you know anything about that? Is
Are you talking about the one next door?
the right next to where the Palace was?
It's like a waste dump or something.
Yeah, my kids call it
landfill.
Stink Mountain.
Yeah. I don't think that's getting touched, is it?
That's being capped. So half of it, the side closest to the Palace has already been capped. And then the other side, I think, was recently capped, or is in the next 12 months. And they were, I don't know the exact plans, but it's going to be like a walking trail. It's like the highest point in Oakland County. So despite, some of the garbage you might see over there, maybe the scent every now and again, I'm told once it's capped and you kind of do it properly, it's actually can be like a nice walking trail. But the reality is, northern Oakland County was landfills back in the day when City of Detroit was growing. And we own a site in Rochester Hills, 100 acres, the old suburban softball, if you know it. Yeah. And that's a landfill that's been capped. It's just that when the City of Detroit was growing, all the construction debris from that just went to North Oakland County because nobody was living here then. And then it got developed, and it turns out like it ends up being this great area, and people from out of town don't get it. Like, why is there a landfill here? You would never think to put a landfill there, but they didn't because nobody was here back then.
Oh, that's interesting. That multi-unit giant development, was developed right there across the street from the suburban softball spot.
Oh, there's new apartments, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's massive. But I heard it was, sort of difficult to develop that because of what was underneath it and that.
Yeah, it's tough soil.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, landfills are challenging.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's probably something that you've got to research and know all about, right?
Too much about. Yeah, I would not recommend it.
So you mentioned office buildings, like how, with COVID, they're tough right now. When you think about '08 and industrial, not many people would touch it. Are there, can you look at office building the same way? Where are these office buildings vacant? Is there a future for these? I mean, what are they? You drive down some of these areas and you're like, look at all these offices. That was the same feeling I had when I looked at industrial in '08.
Good point.
What happens to these big, beautiful buildings that nobody's in?
That's a really good point, actually, when you compare it to industrial. You're right, nobody wanted that. Because when you're in the weeds and you understand the business, sometimes you're your own worst enemy because you know too much. And you've just seen it. You've struggled with these office properties for long periods of time. So is there opportunity? Yes, right. There's always a contrarian view. And there are people buying office for sure. I think the biggest thing to point out difference than industrial is office buildings are CapEx intensive. I mean, think about it. A lot of them have parking decks. Those things need constant cash. You have elevators, roof, heating, cooling, floors. You got to constantly renovate. Making a deal is very expensive because you got to build out the space. Everything about, and rents really don't go up, and they're gross leases. Whereas you take industrial, while nobody wanted to touch it, there still was a lot to like about it for the people that knew it, which wasn't us yet, by the way, but I kind of joke with people. I was like, man, you guys had the best kept secret all these years. CapEx is limited. You really have roof, generally landlord's responsibility unless it's maybe brand new building. Maybe parking lots, it can kind of go either way. You don't have a whole lot else, is the reality. You have a small little office space that's air conditioned. The rest of the warehouse is usually just heated. So your CapEx is way less. The leases are generally net leases, so as expenses rise, tenants pay that, whereas an office, they're capped and there's base years and all these kind of complicated things. So I think it'll probably take people not so into the office building space because some of us are just so jaded. You'll see multi-conversions, and we're already seeing those. You're going to see office buildings converted to multi. But construction costs kind of have to come down to do that. The bottom line is we're way overbuilt.
Yeah.
And most Midwest markets are overbuilt. Where I like office anywhere, but where I think it makes more sense is growth markets. So whether that's the Southeast, Sun Belt, places like that, I think you'll see it because people are still moving there. And I do think over time, more and more people will come back to the office. But a market like Detroit or Chicago, suburban Chicago in particular, I think it'll be tough because rents haven't gone up in 20 years. So pre-COVID, it was a tough asset class. Then you factor in old product, heavy CapEx, less users, overbuilt. You need to convert these buildings to something else. Now, fortunately, a lot of them are in good locations. Like you look at the core of Southfield or Troy. Like these aren't bad locations. Now, there's obviously markets that are, less, not nearly as good locations. But there will be people that make money buying office buildings on the cheap for sure.
That makes sense.
Us personally, I just let someone else go do that.
It's the same feeling. I mean, like I said, it's the same feeling when you used to see these huge industrial buildings vacant. Now you drive and you see these big, beautiful office buildings. You're like, what happens to this? But everything has a cycle. Everything figures itself out somehow, some way. Food. You guys are in the food business. You said you have an uncle that runs that side. Do you have a cousin that's next gen for that?
Yeah. So one of my cousins, Jake. He worked at Mod Pizza, which was one of our brands for a while. He was a brand leader over there. And then now he is actually has his own startup in the food business, kind of in the gig economy, so to speak. And he's also kind of in charge, he's the family representative to the food business. So my uncle, when he eventually retires, he's chairman now, and he has a CEO, you're going to need a family involvement, right, to oversee this business. So my cousin, Jake, has that role. And then we'll see, there's probably 2 more cousins that'll join the business. One is going to join the real estate side. And then, we'll see kind of after that.
So food I grew up in the food business. Our last episode was all about food. Tough business. I mean, we talk about people working in the food business. Like I see our facilities that we own as a family, how difficult that is with the next generation of kids not wanting to work in that business. Nights, weekends. I mean, you guys own how many mostly franchises, right?
Yeah, so we own 170 restaurants and all franchised except we own Oga's. So Oga's, we own the brand.
Gotcha.
And then it's Applebee's, Mod Pizza, Del Taco, and Wendy's.
Gotcha. So Oga's, you own the brand. Are you guys planning on franchising that or being corporate-only owned?
Not sure. Right now, what we're doing with it, because of Gold Belly and DoorDash and Ghost Kitchens and all these opportunities, we're able now to go through Gold Belly, you get pretty good feedback from markets where people want us. And Oga's did national expansion like 30 years ago, long before we were involved. Essentially didn't go well, it failed, but got a lot of Oga's customers in these markets. And so what we've been focused on with Oga's growth outside of Michigan is we get in Ghost Kitchens in these markets and we're on the apps. We're on the food delivery apps.
Nice.
And if they do well enough there, and we, over time it might say, okay, maybe you do open a few brick and mortar locations.
Okay. Well, John being Greek, how do you feel about the brand?
Well, that is a surprise to me. I had no idea that Olga's was out of Michigan. I mean, I didn't think it was anywhere else. That's sort of surprising.
What do you think of their euro?
I mean, it's been a while since I've been to an Olga's.
He's got to know the truth.
But, I was thinking, for my birthday, I want to buy the office lunch today. Maybe it'll be Olga's.
I think it sounds like a terrific idea. It's a different style, the Euro. It's an Olga, technically, than like a traditional Greek.
My wife worked at Olga's through, I want to say, high school. She worked at Olga's.
It's been a while.
West Bloomfield or Birmingham?
I don't know. I can't remember. I should know. But all she talks about is the snackers.
I know my mom and dad knew, the woman.
Olga.
Started,
Yeah. We have a foundation in her name that donates to female-owned businesses.
Oh,
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Where do you see yourself? Where do you see what are your goals for the company? I mean, obviously you got a lot of time left. Knock on wood and pray, because we're all hopefully you're a young man and you got a lot of years left. Where do you see taking the business in the next 30 years? At the end of this thing, where do you see? What's your vision for it?
Yeah, no, it's obviously a good question. And, I never think that far out, right? It's so easy to kind of get caught up in what you're doing, but you do think, because once you have kids, time moves quickly. It doesn't move fast when you don't have kids. Like your 20s take forever.
Well, you made the comment, like, you don't want to just come here and be, just be another person that works here. And when you think about a 100-year-old company, like, It's almost like there's so much history there. It's kind of like past presidents. Like, what do you want your mark to be when you're done? What do you want the next gen to be saying about you? You know, man, my Uncle Jeffrey was, you know, he did this and it was amazing. Or, you know, where do you see them saying about you 100 years from now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's a couple things. I think one, it's clearly the transition to G5. You know, I think, you know, it was very important to, you know, my great-grandfather Lou and then my grandfather Jerry to like pass the business on and, you know, keep the family close while doing it and, you know, not run into any family disputes, which is obviously the norm in family businesses. So I think, you know, the transition, you know, complete the transition, by the way, to G4 where we are now as my dad and uncles, you know, eventually fully retire. So it'd be me and a couple of cousins, and have us, you know, working in unison really well, each kind of in our own niche, but partners in everything together, and then continue to grow the business. I think in the ways that I've been doing it, you know, with this industrial piece, you know, with this development piece of this corporate headquarters, sort of built to suit development. But it's really, I would say, keeping the family atmosphere that we have. Like, we really view our business that everyone's family, not just the family members. And that's why we have people that have been with us 35, 40. I mean, there's people that have been with the business more than years you and I have been alive. All three of us. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
I think all of us are 40, right? And so, I mean, I think it is about the legacy, right? I mean, everyone wants to make money, everyone wants to do well, but it's about, you know, you want the business to be in a better position when you leave than when you came in. Now, I came in at a funky time, 2010, coming out of the Great Recession, but I mean, or the global financial crisis. But I mean, I think those are the key things. It's like really the transition, and just, you know, for people to look and say, wow, you know, because I look back and see like all the stuff my grandfather did. You know, like, you know, this is called giants. Like, he was the giant, you know, not me. And, you know, all the things he did, and he was just figuring it out as he went, right? And, you know, so it would be nice that, you know, my kids will look at, like, you know, their grandparents, and then their kids will look at us. And you just want to see it to continue to be active in the community, you know, philanthropic and all those sorts of things. The business is important, but, you know, the business isn't, you don't live for the business, you live for the family and the things you can give back. And I want those values to remain with the family, you know, for the next 100 years, hopefully.
That's awesome. And the word giants, like, when we were thinking of a name for this, it was like, man, giants, like, you know, guys who control or own big companies. It's like, yeah, that's part of it, but not really. It's really about giants. Like, when we think of it, it's probably, you know, when we think about giants, like when I do, I think about, like, our last episode was Anthony Lombardo. Anthony Lombardo is a master of his craft. Like, he is, you could ask him anything about food and that's your guy. And you know, running a restaurant at a local level, like, he is a giant. The guy is a master of his craft. He understands everything. Talking to you about, you know, you could just see that you got it when you talk about industrial and knowing the numbers and knowing your industry and knowing, you know, what to look for. That to us is like, you know, what's important about this show. And when I think about Anthony, who was our first episode, now you, like, it's you are a giant because your grandpa, yes, your great grandpa, you know, a lot of these guys probably took major risk, but, like, look what you did with the Palace. You said a lot of sleepless nights. It's, you know, it doesn't matter where you fall. There's pressure. You have to study it. You have to be passionate. You have to give up your life for it. And that's kind of the point of Giants. So, you know, but yeah, I think you do an unbelievable job at it.
The hours and the dedication that create the expertise that I think makes you a giant. Yeah. You know, at least for the you know, purpose of the show. Outside of work, you've mentioned your kids a couple of times. Who is Jeff Schostak?
Yeah, family man. So, you know, my wife Rachel and I just celebrated our 11-year anniversary.
Congrats.
On August 18th.
That's great.
We got married up north, so we were up north for it. We usually are. 3 little kids, George, Sophia, and Teddy, 5, 3, and 1. So, you know, I know you guys both have young kids as well, so obviously, like, that's a lot of your time. It's funny how, like, your priorities change, right? You know, like, before you have kids, you kind of go out all the time, you know, my wife and I, you go out 2 nights a weekend and everything's great. You have kids, you're tired. Oh, yeah. They wear you out. And, you know, we try to get one night out because I think it's obviously important, you know. It's so easy to get consumed in the family, but, you know, as the kids are getting older now, it's like, you know, I coach my son's flag football team, you know, which is funny because I never played football, but like I know football, I watch it like anybody else. But so it's a lot of kid-related activities. Love to play tennis, play golf. It's all the stuff that you kind of did when you're little, but they just like evolve into like more like adult sort of like activities. But I would say just we're really big on family. Not just like our immediate nuclear family, but my brother who lives here and they have 4 kids. We were just up at Camp Michigania, and the greatest thing that we do there is my sister has 4 kids, my brother has 4 kids, and she lives in Minnesota, so there's 11 first cousins that all play. Wow. And it's really important for us for the first cousins to be as close as we were growing up as first cousins, because it's different. I know your family's like that, and so it's that's kind of nothing crazy anymore. Those days are long gone.
It's true. It's all you have. I say it all the time. I have 3 kids, and my oldest are twins. And today was their first day of kindergarten, a new school, bigger school, and I dropped them off, and I told I looked at both of them. I said, "What's most important?" And they said, "Each other." I'm like, "Exactly. You guys are lucky. You have each other. A lot of these kids are getting dropped off by themselves. You guys have each other. You look out for each other. You take care of everybody. You don't ever be a bully. You take care of everybody else. And if somebody is being a bully, you make sure you protect the person that's being bullied, and you protect each other. That's most important." And that's how we grew up. I mean, it's the same exact thing, and it's extremely, extremely important. But
passing those values down to the next generation has sort of been the theme of this today.
I mean, we have a ton of family, ton of cousins, ton of kids. Keep having more. I'm actually on call right now for my 4th. Keep waiting for that one, but it's insane. Funny Jeff story before, which you can end with some questions, John, if you have any. But first time I ever golfed with you, you invited me to Knollwood. I find this a funny story. You invite me to Knollwood. You're showing me around. He's giving me a tour of the place. Your grandpa or great grandpa, who founded it?
He didn't found it, but he was one of the early members.
One of the early members, grandfather, right? And he's telling me, "Oh, my grandfather, this, that," and we get to the first tee, and we're like, "All right, what's your handicap?" And this was 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago now. He goes, "I'm a 20-something, not to put you on the spot."
For sure, probably 28.
I go, wait a minute. I go, "My family's been in this country I don't know, 50, 60 years. You guys founded this place. How are you a 20 handicap?" And he looked at me and just smiled. And then, it's probably our first time ever golf. We've golfed a million times since. But
thank you for putting up with my terrible golf.
Oh, has the handicap improved?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Good.
But where I will say Jeff has been extremely, and I told you this before we started the podcast, and not to make you feel awkward or weird, but what I find amazing about you is you have you name 170 restaurants, all this industrial stuff. Just real estate everywhere, 30 states. When you meet you, you'd never know it. And that's what I love the most about you. I think that's really hard to do. A lot of people let that go to their head. We know people who are, don't have companies close to your size that you see them and they're 2nd or 3rd gen guys, and you would think they were the founder and they have this persona. And when you meet you're the exact opposite. You're Jeff. It's almost like I can't believe you're in this position, because it's really, really cool, which to me is an unbelievable compliment, because I think you have a lot of people out there who don't do a good job at that. So when you did get into this position and you did, how do you think that is? Why do you think that is that you did not let it get to your head, where a lot of guys do? Because I'm sure we both know people. Yeah, I know I do. Know people like that.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm a middle child, so I was ignored as a kid.
I was too, you can see.
No, I think it was just probably, honestly, I go back to my grandfather all the time, is just he was, as great as he was and all the great things that he did in the community and in business, he was a fairly low-key guy, he was out there and everybody knew him, but and he just kind of instilled with us, charity starts at home, family glue, and just kind of, we've never been, as a family, we're always just, I don't want to say we're low key, we're out there and people know us, but my parents, I guess, did a good job. I don't know.
Oh, that's awesome.
One thing, we're talking about Detroit and Chicago, and, I really think that it's that generation that created this culture in Detroit of keep your nose to the grindstone and work. Not to say we don't know hot shots or anything like that, but I think that is part of a Detroit culture, whether it still exists or not. I think it at least has been. I mean, and it probably has something to do with the families that came here 100 years ago.
Yeah, there's something to do with that, some Detroit grit and just, coming here as immigrants from Ukraine in the early 1900s. And, even though I wasn't there, you hear the story enough and the struggles, obviously, that generations before you went through, and you like it, it's there with you. Exactly.
All right, I want to end on this. I know as when we're, you've mentioned him in this podcast, George Washington. All right. Did you name your oldest son after George Washington?
Spoke through my mind as well.
Yes and no. So my wife's grandfather was George
Washington.
Yes.
Washington?
No, not George. Obviously.
George Washington was Jewish?
Yeah, you didn't know that? He met one Jew in his life, by the way.
Really?
Yeah. There's a great Ron Chernow book. He's the guy that wrote Hamilton, although a great historian. And you should read it. Honestly, I joke it should be required reading for all American students, because you just get this great history of America and you get great background on the founding of the country, obviously. But it's an 800-page bomber. But it's great. But at some point in the book, he meets some Jewish guy, a doctor, I think, shockingly. But anyway, so I was reading that book when my wife was pregnant, and we didn't know what we were having. And everyone kind of knew we were probably going to be George if it was a boy, because Rachel was really close with her grandfather George, who I unfortunately wasn't able to meet. And so she was like, yeah, if it's a boy, we're going to do George. And I'm reading this book on George Washington. I'm like, this guy's the biggest badass of all time. Yeah, cool. I'm like, I'm definitely into George. Cool. So I was trying to convince her actually to have it be George Washington Schostak.
Sweet.
I did not win that battle, but we named him George Leon, which is my grandfather Jerome Leon. So it's kind of an homage to her grandfather and my grandfather. So a little bit off of George Washington.
Cool.
So you're in a room with George Washington. You're allowed to ask him one question. What's the one question you would ask him?
Wow, it's a good one. I probably knew that when I was reading the book. It was so current. Because it's funny, because you read it and you he was just doing things. He was just like any other founder of a business, basically, just in a way bigger scale, right? Just doing things because he had to. He just had to do this, or he was going to be killed, right? What would I ask him? I wouldn't say how'd you do it, because he just did it. It just kind of was what it was.
I bet his expectation about the longevity of America probably wouldn't have been what it ended up being.
Yeah, I don't think they, foresaw. It's amazing the foresight they had.
I think about there was a lot of great men back then. Why him over everybody else? You know what I mean? And did he really understand if he accomplished what he set out to accomplish? I wonder if he really understood what that meant for the next. We're at 200 and something years now. How many years? 300 years now.
About 250.
Yeah.
He had a great ambition, is what he had. So when they voted to, essentially go to war and not be part of the British Empire anymore, he showed up in his army uniform. And he was a tall guy, right? He was probably only 6'2" or something, maybe 6'3", no one knows exactly, which was really tall back then. And so he showed up in his army uniform and was tall. And so and he did that on purpose. He was a born leader. And so they chose him to be, the leader of the army, and the general of the Continental Army. And so he always put himself in position with never having to ask. He didn't ask to be in charge ever. They always asked him. But he knew what he was doing. He was calculated because he wanted to be in charge, but he didn't. He went about it the right way, and he was just this natural leader. And he had a lot of lonely moments in leadership that we all have today, right? There's times where you just got to sit there and make a tough decision. So I'll have to get back to you on what I would ask him.
All right. Well, Jeff, I really appreciate you coming on. This means a lot. You're awesome. You're a great friend, and for doing this, it's important to us. So thank you. And John, happy 40th.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a great way to get started.
Yeah. It was awesome. And if there's anything you want to end with, you can. But if not, we can't thank you enough.
No, it was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Obviously, always good hanging with you, Simon. Happy birthday. Olga's lunch for the office sounds great.
I like it. That's got a Greek theme, too. That's what people would expect from me. So
we do carry out great. So.
All right. That's
Thanks.
it.
Yeah, thank you guys.